And I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to ServiceNow. So ServiceNow makes work better for people. They transform old manual ways of working into modern digital workflows. So employees and customers get what they need when they need it, fast, simple, and easy. And FlyForm is the premier UK-based ServiceNow partner. We provide our clients with the ultimate ServiceNow experience. We have one of the most experienced teams in the market, and they've done some of the most complex ServiceNow projects in the UK. And our goal that we live by is quite simple. We help our customers deliver exceptional service through the power of ServiceNow. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Phil. And if you guys could let me know through the chat box if everybody can hear me well, I would appreciate that. On to you, Phil.
Perfect. Thanks, Ilse. So happy Wednesday, everyone. Thanks to those of you for taking the time out to join us today and chat a little bit about ServiceNow security options in the platform. So what we're going to try and achieve today is essentially a bit of an overview on some of the kind of modules available to you for security. Some of these you may have seen online and may have heard about. Some of them aren't publicized, and they're options you need to ask your account manager for and things like that. But we'll chat about some of them. By all means, today isn't an exhaustive list because there are actually a lot of options in the platform that people aren't aware of, and the list is quite extensive. And each one of these could be a webinar in its own right in terms of implementation best practices and advantages, disadvantages, etc. But we'll cover as many of them as we can today. Feel free to reach out and ask any questions either on the Q&A today or following the webinar. We'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. So in terms of the agenda, as you can see on the screen here, we're going to run through some of the security options, which include things like IP whitelisting and access control plugin and so on. And we'll talk about some advantages and best practices around those. We'll then move on to some of the ServiceNow encryption options. So there are quite a range of encryption options available today. We'll cover the bulk of them at a high level, just to give you a flavor for what is in the platform and what that could look like for you. And we'll go from there. So the first topic we're going to briefly discuss is IP whitelisting. So what is IP whitelisting? So IP whitelisting essentially allows you to lock down access to the platform via the web URL, so or any other means actually of access. So how that works is based on IP addresses. So you can either apply individual IPs or IP ranges into a whitelist. So as per the term whitelist, basically anything which isn't within the whitelist will automatically get denied. And how this looks and feels is, if you are accessing the instance from a whitelisted IP range, you'll literally log in, it'll be completely transparent to you. If you're on a restricted IP range, you'll get a kind of error 403 type, restricted access denied type page. Obviously, you can use this in various ways. If you do have kind of a VPN or set office ranges, you can easily put them in. Or you can extend it out to anyone or any range you may want to use. By default, this is off in the platform, so some people keep their platforms open and they rely on the other security features. But this is probably one of the more commonly implemented features for people doing some basic kind of level of access control. In terms of advantages and disadvantages of IP whitelisting, so from an advantages perspective, there's no cost implication. So IP whitelisting is a free plugin to turn on within the tool. The technical implementation is very straightforward. So generally, there's no scripting involved. This is a no-code implementation, and it's generally very straightforward to maintain. So you get a GUI list of ranges you can input. Disadvantages. So I've kind of called out here something I just touched on, which is it can be more difficult to maintain in some organizations. And some examples of that could be if you've got, for example, a large number of offices or remote workers. The reason being is if you don't use a VPN or jump off box of some kind for everyone to kind of come in via one or a handful of kind of routes, you'd end up needing to take all the IP addresses of your, staff's home IP addresses, your remote office IP ranges, and you end up trying to manage and maintain all of those. And the same could be said for suppliers. So if you have a large number of suppliers, and maybe we've seen in certain cases that the suppliers actually have a lot of remote workers who aren't on a standard VPN offering, again, it can become quite a cumbersome process. So in terms of kind of best practices and advice, we would advise to try and analyze those ranges in advance and look at what ranges you've got that you need to capture in the tool. And where possible, we would try and advise, if you can, within your corporate environment or your suppliers environments, to push them onto a single kind of VPN ranges or onto a jump box of some kind, whether that's a remote desktop server or another solution. So as we say here, things don't forget to consider. So remote users, suppliers, and also integrations. So your integrations as well could be affected by this. So if you've got integrations coming from different parts of your network or different parts of the infrastructure, then make sure that those are also captured in your initial requirements. One of the key points I've called out here is around the backup ranges. So obviously, when implementing this, we have seen people lock themselves out previously. So they've put in an IP whitelist and they've made a typo and it's not their range, and then they can't get back in. Or you may have a network failure, which means your primary route of access from your head office or wherever you're working from can't get in. So again, do some of that kind of business continuity planning around it. You know, if you lose these office ranges, how will you then gain access? If there's an issue on this, how will you gain access? Or if you do have remote staff, for example, and their connection goes down, you need them to get in, how will they get in? So again, just put some thought in around those kind of those bits and pieces, because that can be where the blockers and the kind of painful bits can come afterward. And again, something I called out there to remember is this doesn't stop ServiceNow staff access in your instance. So this is very much a front-end block. So if you've got ServiceNow working from the administrative access within their environments themselves, they can still go in and do whatever they need to do without any whitelisting or any approval from yourself. So next we'll talk about the access control plugin. So the access control plugin is designed to basically give you some further security around the instance. And what this generally does is this stops ServiceNow staff accessing your instance without explicit permission from you or your administrative team. So some, for example, regulated industries or some of our more secure government clients, they either want to lock out ServiceNow completely, so they want total control over access to their data and their roles and so on. And also, for example, we have clients that only want to allow support access from, for example, UK-based staff or EU-based staff. So where ServiceNow operate to follow the Sun support model, because of data sovereignty and things like that, they may only want to allow access at certain times unless it's absolutely critical. How this looks when you use this is there's a plugin that needs to be enabled, and then you will give access based on a token which corresponds to a username. So you will essentially, when you log a support ticket, for example, with Hi, the engineer in question would probably try and access your instance if you didn't tell them in advance. They'd not be able to get in, and they'd then ask you to enable them a token. They'd give you their username. You can go in and enable and grant that token to them. You can also time restrict that token. So you can either give it as a one-time token and say it's valid for 1 hour from now, or 4 hours from now, or you could say this is on this date and time in the future to allow them in. So if you've got planned maintenance, for example, you can set those tokens up in advance too, or potentially make them recurrent. So every Wednesday night, for example, maybe you have a ServiceNow person on your platform doing something, but it is explicit. So it will only allow the particular username you put in, and nobody else will be able to access apart from, and you'll notice I've called this out here, apart from the most senior staff, technical staff. And what I'm getting at there is, ultimately, as you go further, up the stack, and you get to a fifth line, DBA or someone who's actually got access to the root of the entire infrastructure, or maybe someone with physical access to the platform, there's going to be a layer somewhere where there is somebody that can still access that platform. And ServiceNow would need to advise exactly where that is for you, and you could put potentially other restrictions around that taking place if needed. So advantages and disadvantages for access control plugin. So obviously the advantages being your data is more secure, your instance is more secure if ServiceNow staff is an issue for you. The solution is technically easy to implement. Again, it's an out-of-the-box plugin and is GUI driven, very simple to use for your administrators. And also this is a free plugin, so there's no cost implication. So disadvantages with access control plugin, and these are very important. If you have a fault on your instance and you've got this plugin turned on, obviously your ServiceNow support engineers will not be able to gain access and get into that platform. So there may be some delays. So if you've got a fault that happens and they need access, you may end up in this situation where you do need to get one of these kind of 4th, 5th level or higher engineers within ServiceNow around to kind of let everyone else back in if you'd like to fix your issue. That can cause problems for you if you've got SLAs that you're particularly worried about within the platform. That this does need consideration. You may want to allow, for example, you may have a backup engineer or a backup token. Maybe you allow one particular account to have access or something like that. There are a number of ways we've seen people work around that before, but it's definitely something you need to bear in mind. And again, this will prevent standard and emergency maintenance. So if the token access is not set up, then they won't be able to get in full stop to do that maintenance, including emergency. A couple of best practices around that. So do the risk analysis and just be sure that you need this level of protection. Ultimately ServiceNow are our vendor. They're a trusted party. They've got all the kind of security accreditations and so on. So you may not need this level of protection. I think it's a good question to make sure your stakeholders and yourself really genuinely need to lock them out. If you do go ahead, then ensure you've got robust support documentation in place. So, for example, in the event of an issue, how will you contact ServiceNow? Do you have a backup access method in place for you or for them? Create some backup access methods, so jump boxes or VPN ranges. Again, so tying back into the IP whitelisting, you need to be able to get in both from an IP whitelist perspective and from the access control plugin perspective. And for both of these options, ensure you've got the business's approval and buy-in. So if there is a potential issue around interrupted support, that the business has kind of agreed that the security provisions were more important than maintaining the support kind of arrangements and SLAs. Okay, so next we'll talk about two-factor authentication. So two-factor authentication these days is probably a lot more common to people, as in they're aware of this. So a lot of large corporates use this in their own environments anyway. And going back in the day where we used to have remote security tokens from RSA. So you can essentially back off two-factor to a token-based identity provider. It could be an internal token-based system you run, or it could be a third-party identity provider, for example, Okta or another. The crypto card is another one that government bodies. It's a CESG-approved solution that used to be in place. They can be a hard or soft token, so you could have a physical token that you keep on your keyring or in your wallet, or a lot these days people have moved to soft tokens, so an authenticator app on your phone, similar to when you use two-factor on your Google Drive or other type of Dropbox and other enterprise tools that you like to turn this on in. So how the kind of two-factor authentication process works really briefly. So one of your users will navigate to the instance URL. If they're already logged into the IDP and there's an active session, then they'll get allowed in. If there's no session, then they'll get redirected over to the identity provider page. And in this example, I've used CryptoCard for that. At this point, the user inputs the credentials, so they'll need to put in authenticate into the two-factor provider, which could be their one-time passcode from the token. If they're successful in that request, the identity provider will process that request, and if successful, create a single sign-on token for them. Usually we see SAML2 or OAuth being the protocols of choice. That token gets passed back to the user, and that then goes across to the ServiceNow web server as a token. The server picks that up and allows the user into the system. At this point, the user will see the authentication has been successful, and they'll get the home page as normal. Obviously, if they can't get through that token phase, then they'll get login denied. So advantages and disadvantages for two-factor. So advantage, it vastly improves login security. So from a just getting in perspective, it's a very nice, easy, valuable solution, good impact. It reduces the likelihood of the majority of standard login attacks, so brute force and phishing and so on. Disadvantages, obviously, if you don't use this already within your corporate environment, then there could be some administrative overhead to set up a new token, a new system, and so on. And potentially, if people do have problems with the authenticated token itself, you bring in essentially a whole little new service wrap. So it's just something you need to be aware of it more as an organization as opposed to a tooling administration perspective. So next, we're going to move into some of the stuff around dedicated environment and encryption options. So We'll start by talking about the dedicated environment and what that is and why it exists in this kind of perspective. So there is an option with ServiceNow to take out a completely dedicated environment. And what that looks like is it's your own hardware in the data center, or ServiceNow's hardware provided to you with a dedicated stack. It provides you with your own application database servers, so they're completely standalone. No one else is on them. There's no shared data being passed around in that stack. It's completely yours. You're essentially living in a partial private cloud. The reason I say partial is obviously once you leave that hardware stack, you'll still be potentially within a shared LAN and so on within the DC. Again, you'd need to speak to ServiceNow if you needed options even further past the network layer. But essentially, from a hardware perspective, you're on dedicated kit. And the reason we're talking about this today is because this is actually a prerequisite for full disk encryption. So we're going to come to full disk encryption in a minute, but full disk encryption is an option available to customers of ServiceNow to request and discuss. But to get the full disk encryption, you have to have the dedicated environment separately. They're both paid options and they both carry a different price. So you can't just buy full disk encryption and that covers your dedicated environment cost. You will need to purchase both. Excuse me. So advantages and disadvantages for dedicated environment. So there's the good thing with a dedicated environment, it doesn't introduce any functionality restrictions. It's the highest level of segregation you can get with being in the shared tenancy, apart from going on to an on-prem, and it enables you to use full disk encryption should you want that. Disadvantages, so there's a very high cost entry point. You'd need to speak to your own rep to find out what that point is, but it's a typically six-figure number to enable dedicated environment. It comes with storage limitations. I mean, these are very high, multiple terabytes of storage still, but it's important to remember that because you're in a dedicated environment, you're provisioned a number of disks with a certain number of space associated with them. And when you hit those limits, you'll then have to pay to add additional disks into your array there and increase your storage or reduce your storage, which isn't something people tend to come across in the shared infrastructure per se. Another disadvantage, not directly related to this one, but as part of it, is obviously a lot of people do this because they want to go down the full disk encryption road. If you do that, there are further costs. Some people are actually happy just to be on dedicated hardware. A number of years ago, that was a big prereq for many government clients doing IL3 or restricted as is known now. We're seeing less of that now, but if you go higher up the stack to kind of more towards secret or IL5 as used to be known and IL4, then people may still need these options if they've chosen not to go on-prem. So full disk encryption. So this is when we basically fully encrypt the disk using a hardware-based solution. So all the data is encrypted at rest. The disk is completely encrypted. All your database, everything within it also carries that encryption. ServiceNow hold and manage the keys for this, so you don't hold these keys and get to encrypt that. They hold that key and put the encryption on. And the key to remember on this as well is all instances need to be encrypted because it's in your dedicated environment, in your stack, so everything within that stack gets encrypted. With the full disk encryption, you get your production instance and the standard 2 non-production instances included. If you have more than that, then there can be additional cost associations again on top for provisioning that to those additional instances. So advantages for full disk encryption. So it's a hardware-based encryption, so it's superior strength to a software-based solution, which we'll discuss shortly. It doesn't present you any impact to functionality or use of the tool day to day. So this is only impacting your disk at rest. It's not impacting the operation of the product. Fields are not getting any kind of restrictions on them for usage. You also don't need to worry about any internal changes to your network and so on. So it is purely handled in the data center by ServiceNow on your behalf. Disadvantage-wise, so I've put ServiceNow hold and manage the keys as a disadvantage. So generally this is okay, but there are certain government clients or highly regulated bodies around FS or pharma and some type of industries like that, where they prefer to hold the keys themselves. So this solution is a ServiceNow option where they hold the key. Again, there's a substantial entry point for the cost of this. It's a lot lower than the full environment, but it's still a high price. And when you combine it with the fact you have to have the full environment anyway, if you don't have that already, then it does add up to a very expensive option. And I say expensive, and ultimately, if this is something you need for your industry, then that's the price that these things kind of cost, whether you do it via this cloud or via a private implementation. But if you're just kind of casually looking at this as a solution, then it can be a very expensive route to get what you need. And the other thing to call out is obviously this is still a data at rest solution. So this doesn't protect your data in transit. It doesn't add anything extra to those parts of the process. So the cost to value ratio, for yourself might not be adequate for what you need. So looking at database encryption next. So this is a fairly new addition to the catalog. I think this became available in the London release, so the most recent. And what database encryption does is now offers us a software-based solution to this. So all data is encrypted at rest still. As this is handled within software as opposed to hardware, what this does mean is you don't need to have a full dedicated environment. So you can take that large six-figure number away, which is a very attractive option for some people. ServiceNow still hold and manage the keys in this solution. And again, all instances still need to be encrypted as part of this because they do it on your logical environment as opposed to on the physical environment we talked about just now. Advantages of database encryption. So there's no functionality restrictions, so you're not going to have any trouble operationally or otherwise in terms of using the tool. You don't need any additional hardware requirements for this, so there's nothing else you need to add into your LAN or your environment to use it, and it doesn't require a dedicated environment purchase. There is obviously a cost association, but when you add that compared to the hardware based, this becomes a much more attractive position. Disadvantage-wise, so again, ServiceNow do hold and manage the keys, which may be an issue for your organizational body. Cost implications, so there's a substantial entry point cost again, nowhere near as high as the full environment we just discussed, but it's still it's not an insignificant sum. And again, with this, each instance over the first two incur additional fees in the sub-productions. So you'll get your database encrypted for your production and two sub-prods, but anything on top of that will incur additional fees again. The other thing we mentioned here is that it's only as strong as the operating system security and physical access. And what I mean by that is, because this is a software-based solution, ultimately, if someone can crack the operating system within that cloud, and there's many layers before they would get to a point where they could do that within the ServiceNow infrastructure. But if they did, then they could potentially gain access to those keys or potentially try and modify some of those keys and permissions, and so on. And also from a physical access perspective, if there were ever any physical access concerns around where the databases are held, then again, that could give someone a different angle into that data, but highly unlikely. So encryption support, which is generally the option we talk about in the past, when we've always talked about encryption in the platform. So this is basically an encryption option for you to basically provide an enhanced security for your data at rest only. It's field level, so it's one database column. So any field in particular, this can be applied to. Again, ServiceNow hold and manage the encryption keys for this particular solution. How encryption support works at a super high level for today is essentially you'll create an encrypted field within your platform. You previously couldn't encrypt any of the out-of-the-box fields, so you needed to create a custom field for the encryption. So if you needed to use an out-of-the-box field per se, you would probably need to hide that field and create a clone that field for encryption purposes for usage in the tool. And how that looks then is when your user loads a form, there'll be an encrypted field there. How this works is there's an encryption context. That context is created and is assigned essentially much in the way that people assign roles. And in fact, you can assign the encryption context to a role if you want. So if someone holds a certain role, they hold the encryption context, or you can push it against a person individually if needed. They'll be able to input data into that encrypted field. And when they hit the send button, essentially that data is sent to the instance over the internet. So obviously we're all using HTTPS now. So in all these solutions, when we talk about the data not being protected, during transit. Ultimately, it is via HTTPS, but many people aren't happy with, especially the more secure industries. If they're more vulnerable to significant attack, then they prefer that data to be encrypted further via separate key mechanisms outside of HTTPS. The data is obviously sent to ServiceNow via the internet. The instance receives that data. It knows the user's got the encryption context, so it encrypts that data and writes it into the field. That data then sits within the database at rest in its encrypted state. When a user loads up that form on the other end of this process, if the user doesn't hold the encryption context, it'll be a blank field, or an encrypted data set will show. They can't see anything in a decrypted form within that field. If the user does hold the encryption context, then the system will recognize that, and it will decrypt the data and present it back to the user. So advantages of encryption support. So there's no cost implication. So this is a free plugin that can be enabled. It's also a more mature solution, and what I mean by that is this is the longest standing option. So it's better understood. We've been through a lot of the pitfalls in the past. Encryption was a problem for things like record producers, or if you needed to use encrypted data within a workflow, for example, because the system itself is not capable of decrypting this data. It can only do it when the user's encryption context is presented. So that can be a challenge. These days, it's going to become a lot more supportive. So the workflows and the other parts of the tool are a lot better now at dealing with encryption support. We used to have to write a lot of custom code to get around that, but that's kind of going away. Disadvantage-wise, so again, ServiceNow hold and manage the keys. May not be an issue for you, but can be for some organizations. So again, it's an internal question. The biggest thing to note on these disadvantages against encryption support is the functionality restrictions that you inherit as part of this. So you cannot search on an encrypted field. So where you usually go in and do a search, for example, say you're searching for a phone number or reference number or site name, if that is a field that you've chosen to encrypt in the platform, you will not be able to search that field. You won't get any results. And the reason, again, coming back, is the system itself cannot decrypt that field. So the system can't, because the system user can't hold an encryption context and can't decrypt that data itself to do its searches. It's only when the user tries to access that data and presents the context can that data be decrypted. So as well as not being able to search on that data, you also can't sort or filter on those encrypted fields. So where you're usually in the GUI and you're in list view and you're right-clicking and you're drilling down, you're maybe using the header field to sort that data and ascending, descending, etc. None of those options will work for the data. And again, that's because the system can't decrypt it. So you will sort and it'll just sort into a random order based on what it sees in the encrypted data, or will produce nothing at all. And the same thing will happen for filtering. So the best practice advice around this is to be very clear on the requirement and really be sure that you do need to encrypt the field that you're choosing to do, because you are going to introduce operational challenges around that data. Some people there are a number of ways around that. You could create extra fields with kind of code words and things like that people tend to do, and they tend to marry things up. But without a doubt, it increases some complexity and issues. So be very sure before you implement to that field, and also what the outcome is that you need at the end of this. If it breaks operationally completely for you, then obviously it's not a very viable solution. So moving on to edge encryption. So edge encryption, as well as encrypting the data at rest, can also encrypt the data in transit. So as it's going across the internet. It again works on a field level, so column level encryption. The main difference with this, apart from the fact there's two major differences. One is the fact it's in transit, so it's encrypting via the connection, but also the client holds and manages the encryption keys. So you, the client, can hold your own encryption keys as opposed to ServiceNow holding them, which for the most secure agencies, they do tend to want to hold those keys. However, this does require a paid subscription and a number of hardware scenarios on your end to make this work, which we'll cover in a high level of detail shortly. As you can see on this image here, there's an concept of an edge encryption proxy. So this is a software-based appliance that you need to put inside your network. There's also the requirement to route the data internally in your LAN via that proxy before it goes out of your internet gateway to ServiceNow to enable any encryption or decryption jobs to take place. So as you can see, compared to the encryption support, this is a lot more involved solution. How this works, again, at a very high level. So the user will load a form. There'll be a field which is marked as being edge encrypted. When users are using ServiceNow in this setup, the data will get routed to the encryption proxy internally in the network before going to the internet gateway. The encryption proxy will look to see if there are any incoming jobs for encryption or decryption. So it'll receive the data from the user. It'll say, hey, okay, I can see this is an encrypted field. I hold some keys, so which key applies to this data? I'm going to apply the key, encrypt the data, and then I'm going to pass that encrypted data through to my internet gateway, over the internet, and up to the instance where it's written. Now, although the data, I've called this out here, so the data is actually then written into the instance as a plain text type field. And what I'm calling out there is, on the other solution, the data is actually in a kind of quote encrypted type. ServiceNow can treat this data as plain text because the actual data is passed to it in an already encrypted fashion, so it doesn't care about any further encryption jobs at the instance end. So on the reverse of that process, the user will load a form. It's got an edge encrypted field within it. That data will come from ServiceNow across the internet into your internal gateway. It'll then get routed internally back to the encryption proxy. And at that point, again, the engine will look, see the encrypted data. Has the user got the encryption context and so on? If it does, it'll perform that decryption job, and it'll pass that data back to the user in the clear text form for the user to read. In terms of requirements, as we've talked about briefly here, so you'll need internal LAN changes and routing changes to route the data both inbound and outbound via the encryption proxy. The proxies support around 500 simultaneous users at any given time. So in terms of that sizing, that's an important job for you to look at. If, for example, you think you may have 1,000 or 2,000 users, then obviously 2,000 users simultaneously is worth pointing out. Then they would need 4 proxy servers. If you then take into account the fact that for many of you, redundancy is key, then you may also need to put a high availability pair in place. So for example, 2,000 users would need 8 proxies, or if you're happy with the minimum up to 500, then you could put one in and maybe another one for a failover. They don't support kind of native clustering as such. So ServiceNow advise you to place them behind put them into a load balancer pool on the kind of high lowest connection type configuration, and allow the load balancer to pass the data between the proxies as needed. And obviously if one gets dropped or dies, then the load balancer will become aware and pass the traffic all through the other one. So advantages and disadvantages. So advantages, key ones here, that is that the client or yourself hold the encryption keys. So that can be a huge win for your security team. The data is protected in transit as well. So as opposed to not just relying on HTTPS, is encrypted with your key, and also that can be up to AES 256 strength. There's also a lot less functionality restrictions and encryption support. So where in encryption support you can't sort or filter, the edge encryption does allow you to do something called order preserving and equality matching. So what that means is you can choose a different encryption algorithm. And it'll allow you to do a number of things. One is equality matching, which means basically when it encrypts data, if you put the same word in every time, so if you write the word car, it'll always encrypt that to the same string, which means when you need to do a matching query, so if you want to do a filter and you want to pick everything that matches the encrypted version of car, then the tool will still allow you to do that if you pick that encryption algorithm. The sorting and so on as well can also be, and searching can also be further enhanced. That needs the use of a SQL server. So you would need a SQL server within your LAN side of your environment. And what that does is, using the kind of order preserving functionality, will allow you to sort based on some other parts of the encryption algorithm. And there's a lot of information on the wiki of those in detail, or if you do have Q&A, obviously shout it out and we can pick it up at the end of the call or separate to the call if needed to talk you through exactly what that looks like. And obviously, I think the key thing to point out there is at the strongest end of encryption, you've got kind of AES 256 available with no order preserving and equality matching. Obviously, by introducing things like equality matching, you technically kind of come down a level in security because you're allowing, for example, the same patterns to be matched. Still a very low risk of, still a super secure solution, but that's how that breaks down, and it kind of becomes a question for you to match what you need versus the level of security you truly need as well. So some of the disadvantages, so there's a cost implication. So this is not a free option like the encryption support, so it may be cost prohibitive to some of you. The edge proxy devices, so ultimately you're going to have to install some new infrastructure to support this, and they're going to need managing and maintenance as per, for example, the same way a mid server would. Performance issues can be a challenge, and that's not so much from a ServiceNow perspective that there's something wrong with these, but they are, this is a little bit of a complicated setup. You're routing all your traffic through there. You can introduce problems in your LAN with routing or switching kind of problems. If you have kind of load balancer issues, can also introduce more. So anything kind of within your network can introduce performance issues to this. And then you can have challenges with the throughput that those boxes can handle, which is why they advise on the 500 simultaneous users. But I would advise also, even from a throughput perspective, depending on how many tickets and bits of data are being passed through, is worth doing some kind of stress test on those to make sure they can handle the requirement that your organization needs. Just a really quick recap on some of the top level options we've just talked about. So, and we'll share this. I think this may be even on the wiki. So you've got edge encryption. So it offers you standard, equality preserving, and order preserving encryption. So as we talked about, it can give you some options around sorting and matching. The data sent to ServiceNow is already encrypted by you. It supports string text, attachments, URLs, and journal entry. So with the edge encryption, you can also encrypt your journals, so your work notes and so on. It supports AES 128 and 256, and it's tokenized for the pattern match data. So again, the equality preserving stuff we've talked about. You hold the key as the customer, and the additional requirements, as you can see there, are the on-site encryption proxy. You will need an encryption key store, so there are a number of supported key stores you can use, but you'll need to configure your own key stores and keys. There's an optional MySQL database for the order preserving functions. And you'll need all or part of those to implement edge. So column level, so the data is encrypted at rest based on the user role in the instance. It doesn't support journal encryption, so that's something that you won't be able to do. Supports the same level of AES 128 and 256. There's no tokenization, so you can't do the sorting and so on that we talked about. The keys are held by ServiceNow. It says they're managed by the customer. I think you can manage them to a degree, but ServiceNow completely have access to those keys. So you can have the option to generate those keys yourself and use your keys, but they become part of the instance which ServiceNow admins ultimately would be able to see those keys. But however, there's no additional requirements within your environment for that. And then finally, database encryption. So encryption of the data at rest, when not being processed in the instance. So obviously this is essentially encrypting everything, so everything is supported. It only goes up to AES 128. There's no tokenization, and ServiceNow completely own the creation of these keys for the database encryption. There's no hardware or other network or any other requirements required for yourselves for that option or the column level. So just some general encryption best practices. So invest the time up front to get kind of a full and clear understanding of your encryption requirements. So as I said earlier, what we saw a few years back was people would just pick in fields to encrypt because they kind of maybe had, a mild feeling that they needed to be encrypted. And what that introduced over time was huge operational challenges. So people all of a sudden couldn't get the reports they needed, or there were, P1s or outages or incidents coming in and people couldn't access the data they needed in order to sufficiently serve their customer base. So be sure you need to do this. Make sure you speak to your privacy impact assessment teams or your cybersecurity teams or your information assurance teams and really understand what is the actual requirement and do you really need to do it. And if you do need to do it, then look at ways where maybe you can do some kind of, as we talked about earlier, code words or other ways of making the data work for you. And that ties into the next point around overspeccing. It's the same thing. Don't overspec it. And also from a cost perspective, do you really need to go down that full environment and full disk encryption scenario? Do you need edge? Do you need to introduce the complexity of edge encryption, or can you encrypt some fields with encryption support to get you to a suitable standard? And look at it on a field by field basis. And again, it's just a case of, you know, the underlying message is be fussy. You know, really look at each field on it and weigh up that merit individually, case by case. Make sure you speak to your partner or ServiceNow rep to discuss the latest options. A prime example, as I just gave you, is, you know, previously last year, clients may have been taking out expensive full environment options to get full disk encryption, only to find out database encryption was becoming available in the London release. So, you know, your partner contact, whether that be us or another partner, or your ServiceNow team, should be able to advise you and help you on looking at that requirement and understanding what's available today, but also what is available on the roadmap. You know, is there something coming up on the next release or two that will tick the box for you and save you a significant amount of time and money and effort to get that solution in place? And that's the end of my section of the presentation, guys. So I'll hand back over to Ilse for any Q&As that we've got today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Phil. I know that was a lot of information, and just remember that we'll be sending you the link so you'll have access to this presentation as well as the video recording. So I do have a few questions that have come through for the chat. So Phil, one of the questions is, would the access control plugin allow us to control all access from ServiceNow themselves, or would they still have support access by default?
So generally they wouldn't have support access either. So essentially they would get locked out completely once that plugin's enabled. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, some ways around that could be, you could, you know, work closely with ServiceNow and pick potentially an engineer or a handful of engineers that maybe have been vetted to a higher level of security that meet your needs, and maybe you only allow those particular engineers access at any given time. But otherwise, the plugin will lock out ServiceNow for all intensive purposes.
Okay, great. Can you please tell us a little more about the Direct Connect functionality?
Sure. Yeah, so one of the things I didn't mention actually was around when we say to talk to your partner or ServiceNow for other options. So there is, of course, these days a Direct Connect option. So you can pay to have private fiber to connection between your premises or VPN and ServiceNow directly themselves. So that is a costed option, but I think the cost right now is probably around a third of the cost of, for example, database encryption. Excuse me. And it can allow you to not need to worry about so much around. So, for example, if you look at edge encryption, you need appliances, devices, and all these kind of things to send that data, where for a lot of clients it's far easier to just say, let's just get a direct connect straight into the instance. We don't need to worry about the complex encryption across that line because it's private and we don't have any risk there. So direct connect can be a really good option for that.
Great. So I have a couple of other questions. So one of them is, are there any other key restrictions with encryption that we need to be aware of?
So I think it's a case of looking at it for your use. There are definitely more restrictions I mentioned today, and it's a case of looking at them on your side on a case-by-case basis. I think I mentioned some of them earlier. So previously we did see restrictions in the tool for things like workflows and for example, on the portal, when you were doing record producers and such things like that, encryption could become a problem, and we needed to script kind of encryption and decryption jobs into workflows and record producers and so on. So there can be other implications, and it's worth just having a quick check on a case-by-case basis of what they could be. So there's a lot of good info on the wiki, there's a lot of good info on the community, and obviously partner network and people like us, we're happy to answer any basic questions around those things too.
Awesome. So I have one last question. How do you hold credentials to enable the item layer of the service options? So for example, asset discovery.
It's a good question, and it's definitely a large consideration with ITOM. So you can choose to encrypt those fields. So for example, if you take discovery as an example, if you're discovering IP addresses and you want to write those into encrypted fields, then that can be done. It would probably need some scripting. It certainly did a couple of years ago when we last did that. I think that's something I'd probably take away and see what the current thinking is. around. Again, what we've done previously, and the biggest issue you're going to see with this is because encryption, the general encryption support doesn't like out-of-the-box fields, that can become a little issue with things like discovery, because discovery, obviously, to make it work nicely, you want to kind of keep it using out-of-the-box fields, but then if you need to encrypt, then you can't. And you can kind of go around in circles a little bit with that. So I think there's probably a little bit of an architectural question around, do you recreate the fields exactly as they look, and try and maintain that kind of out-the-box look and feel and usability? But it's definitely much more considerations to be taken into place when you start looking at those advanced ITOM capabilities. But I'll take away as well the specific question around how to hold those keys and where they would be stored. I'll come back with the latest thinking, which I'll publish out to the group who attended as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Phil. So that brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you, everybody, for attending. If you have any questions, additional questions, or if you want to give us an idea of related topics that you want to hear about in the future, we're here to serve, and we really want to give you the information that you're looking for. So that's greatly appreciated. You can contact us at contact@flyform.com. So that's fairly easy. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join. And as always, if you've got any feedback, good or bad, we really want to hear that feedback either way, as Il said. So please reach out either to the contact form or to myself, and yeah, let us have that feedback. And otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your day.